Thank you for this invitation. It's good to be part of Globe EU again after many years. And I'm particularly happy that I'm joined today by Janez Potočnik, who, as most of you know, has a long record as Commissioner of the European Commission. From 2004 to 2009, Janez was Science Commissioner, and then for another 5 years, Environment Commissioner. And it was during Janez's term of office as Environment Commissioner that the Circular Economy package was launched in 2014. And we are going to talk about materials in particular this morning. 50 years have passed since the presentation of the limits to growth to the Club of Rome. The central message, as we all know, in the limits report was that the quest for unlimited growth in population and material goods on a finite planet would run into problems in the form of resource depletion and pollution, and that there was a serious risk that such problems would eventually bring the economic system down. Not in the next couple of years or decades, but during the 21st century. We are in a wake-up call meeting this morning, and you could say that the limits to growth was really a wake-up call to the world. But the world, I'm afraid, did not listen. The main message of the limits report was that population and production growth were pushing humanity towards a cliff. And today, more and more people recognize that we are now at the edge of the cliff. Earth has crossed multiple planetary boundaries, while widespread inequality is causing deep instabilities in many societies. And the question really is there a way out? As a follow-up to the limits report, the Club of Rome, the Potsdam Institute, the Stockholm Resilience Center, and Norwegian Business School agreed to work on a new report a few years ago. We gave this new project the name Earth for All. We were supported by a group of some 40 thought leaders from around the world. Among them, we benefited greatly from having people like Carlota Perez, Sharon Burrows, Emmanuel Faber, Tim Jackson, Kate Ravert, Otto Scharmer, and Janez Potočnik involved. They gave us great support. And the main backdrop of the report was today's economic system, which in our view, first of all, destabilizes the physical environment by degrading ecosystems and accelerating climate change. It's furthermore destabilizing the economy by widening the gaps, aggravating inequality, and thirdly, it undervalues the future. And the question for us was, how can we provide the vast majority of the world population with a decent standard of living within the planetary limits? And I would say that Earth for All, which was presented some months ago, is both an antidote to despair and a roadmap for a better future. We were using very powerful state-of-the-art computer modeling to explore which policies would be likely to deliver the maximum good for the majority of people. We came to the conclusion that we need 5 major turnarounds to really help this happening and to achieve prosperity for all within the planetary limits in a single generation. The first turnaround is to address poverty with maximum force. The goal should be that the average salary level in 2050 should be at least $15,000 a year. The second one is addressing inequality. And the goal here is that the richest 10% of the population in any given country should not command more than 40% of the national income. Today, we are hovering around 60% in many countries. The third one is the empowerment of women through expanding education for girls and widening access to reproductive health. The fourth turnaround is about transforming food systems by moving towards regenerative agriculture, reduced food waste, and changing diets. And the fifth turnaround is about transforming energy systems by replacing fossil fuels with primarily renewables, by electrify almost everything and putting emphasis on energy efficiency. So for all, it's primarily about these 5 turnarounds, but they won't happen unless they are accompanied by a number of flanking measures. First of all, we need to vastly improve international cooperation. That is to say, multilateralism. It's not easy in today's world with Putin's aggression in the background. Secondly, we need to rethink economic policy frameworks, long-termism instead of short-termism, well-being indicators instead of growth in GDP, stakeholder values instead of shareholder values, and then a tax reform. One of the proposals is to tax the use of nature and reduce the tax on labor. But just as important will be to address rapidly increasing material consumption, primarily in industrialized countries. And when we talk about climate mitigation, as you know, all focus so far has been on the phase out of fossil fuels. And this is crucially important, but materials are equally important. The International Resource Panel, where Janez is one of the co-chairs, has estimated that the extraction and processing of materials, here we speak about biomass, fossil fuels, minerals and metals, make up at least 50% of global carbon emissions, and in addition, result in 90% of the biodiversity loss. Demand for materials has tripled since 1970 and is likely to double again until 2060. If we do not change course, of course. But it will not be easy. The estimate is, and this is just one of the examples, that there will be built as much urban infrastructure in the next 30 years as has been built hitherto on planet Earth. And if this happens with today's materials and technologies, steel, concrete, plastics, etc., we can forget about the Paris climate goals. Aggregate demand for materials is one challenge. The other one is, of course, that materials are very unevenly distributed. A citizen in Sweden, my own country, has a material footprint around 25 tons per capita and year. The footprint of a citizen in Africa south of Sahara is in the range of 2 tons. It is evident that the footprints of people in low-income countries have to increase to improve their standard of living. But if they reach the level of Sweden, the planet would not be able to cope. Waste and pollution, including carbon emissions, would be exploding. And many resources would also likely be in short supply. Hence the challenge to lower material footprints in the rich countries and the overconsumption that is taking place, while increasing them in the poor countries. And how to make it happen is a real challenge. So it's a question of doing more with less, to address overconsumption in the rich countries and among well-to-do citizens all over the world. And at the same time, we have to increase material consumption among the poor. The energy turnaround is one example where we try to describe how this could happen. The inequality turnaround is another, addressing overconsumption by taxing the rich. As you referred to already, Sirpa, we have done a number of deep dive papers complementing Earth for All. And Janez, Potočnik and myself, we have tried to address material consumption. So far, resource use and its consequences has mostly been addressed from the supply side by cleaning production processes. What Janez and I do in the paper is trying to approach it from the demand side instead. And our assumption is that in all major areas of consumption, there are ample opportunities to provide for human needs in more intelligent, more efficient, and less wasteful ways. Moving from linear to production to circular production is part of the answer, but our efforts have to go much further. And I now hand over to Janez to explain more in detail how we would like to present this demand side approach. Janez, over to you.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Anders. Since Anders has already so well explained the essence of our joint contribution, some repetition is of course unavoidable. but better to hear some arguments twice than never. So let me start by pointing why it is so critical to keep the management of our natural resources, including, of course, materials, in focus. The departure point, actually, of our approach. As already mentioned, according to International Resource Panel, by the way, Anders forgot to mention that he's the member, a science policy interface in the area of natural resources, resource use is at the roots of the triple planetary crisis. So, resource extraction and processing drive 90% of land-related biodiversity loss and water stress, as mentioned, 50% of greenhouse gas emissions, and 1/3 of health-related pollution impacts. And the trends are alarming, as Anders already mentioned. Resource use harbors deep inequalities. High-income countries have benefited most and have driven the planetary crisis, while emerging and developing countries hold least responsibility and are facing the worst consequences. The World Inequality Lab recently published its 2023 Climate Inequality Report, showing how much inequality is actually driving climate impact. The top 10% of global emitters are responsible for 50% of global carbon emissions. So this is not just a country-level story. The highest consumers everywhere are responsible. The report shows that carbon emissions inequalities within countries deserve as much attention as between the countries. So the central question we should ask is, how do we meet human needs and maximize our well-being in the most energy and resource or materials efficient way? For that, and this is the point frequently repeated by the IRP, we would need to decouple our economic growth and well-being from the natural resource use and from environmental impacts. And it is clear that in high-income countries, absolute decoupling is needed. When analyzing what would need to be done to make the visionary European Green Deal implementable in a global environment, the Club of Rome, Systemic and Open Sciences Foundations in International System Change Compass identified 3 major blind spots. First, the lack of holistic system change approach. Leaders, as well as public administrators, but vastly majority of us, lack capacity or knowledge of how to translate system change visions into our concrete policies and investments, which sometimes ends in conflicting actions and policy logic that hinder the real transformation. So if you would look to the climate talks, if I would summarize them in one sentence, we need to reach the zero net emissions by 2050, whatever it will cost. So what is our point is, let's look to the cost also, because we need to avoid the simultaneously potential problems. Second, by failing to go to the roots of the problem, meaning addressing the fundamental drivers and pressures, we lack focus on natural resource use as well as market signals, leading consumers and producers' behavior. Our current system does not incentivize sustainable resource use. In fact, quite the opposite. As consumers, of course, we must behave responsibly, no doubt, and we must be well informed. But when addressing consumption, I do not want to point the finger only at the consumer, even if the choices we make are critically important and we have to take responsibility for them. But the point is also that many consumption-related questions are in the hands of policymakers and producers. Consumers are confused. We ask them to behave responsibly, but market signals are sending them in the opposite direction. We have to pay more, for example, for healthier and environmentally responsible products, for example, food. And it is on policymakers to fix that. We are also bombarded and manipulated by advertisements from producers. I have picked this message a few days ago at Brussels airport. Working hard to bring you a new shopping experience. And third, as already well explained by Anders, it's the lack of the demand side focus. Policy attention, also in our climate efforts, is mainly given to the supply side of the economy, to the cleaning of the existing economic system. It is lacking the attention to the demand consumption side. Our climate efforts are stalling, and if we are to restart and make them effective, to start closing the existing gap among high-income and low-income countries, we must stop ignoring the inherent wastefulness of our production and consumption systems, particularly in high-income countries. We must ask the question who is actually surpassing planetary boundaries and living beyond their safe operating space by not integrating commitments in their NDCs that address material and consumption footprints. For example, it would be in vain to decarbonize the production of steel, as important as that of course is, if it is used to produce underutilized cars and empty houses, which contribute to traffic and property market bubbles, but not to the real social prosperity. Standards and behavior patterns of the current economic model were set by us, by high-income countries. And only by looking in the mirror first, we would give nobody an excuse to repeat past mistakes and avoid collective failure. Last IPCC report underlines the fact that our survival is now about speed and scale, and both are currently not on our side. Which leads me to the solutions and necessary steps, to the how part of the question. Trying to maintain the current economic system and at the same time fixing the chronic triple planetary crisis, it's not consistent and just creates a lot of confusion and lobbying. It's simply not possible to do both. We have prioritized the prevailing broken economic system for so long that it sometimes proves impossible for decision makers to imagine a different one. Any suggestion to deviate from our resource extraction, growth-driven path, it's met with accusations of being anti-well-being and having disregard for people's hard-earned livelihoods. In essence, it is just the opposite. Few basic shifts are needed. First, we must shift away from the prevailing economic logic which puts humans too many times in function to economic growth, simplistically defined by GDP, towards an economy that is effectively meeting human needs. The current logic is both ethically and ecologically unsustainable, and we need to set the order right. Second, we need to move from an economy considering humans as external and superior to nature to an economy acknowledging that we are embedded with nature. Destroying nature is destroying ourselves. Third, we need to move from an extraction-based production to a circular creation-based production. We should stop stimulating extraction-based economic success and rather reward the responsible, innovative, creative ways of meeting human needs. And finally, we must fix our governance structures and make them fit for purpose. This is the paradigm shift in leadership and governance that is needed. Realization that states' long-term sovereignty can only be protected through genuine, deep cooperation right now with the institutional reforms to match. A question not asked for the first time, but not yet adequately answered. In short, we must improve our collective resilience, and we would need a well-designed intergenerational pact. In the next IRP Global Resource Outlook 2024, to be released next February at UNIA, the IRP will follow the well-being logic and redefine sectors as systems. Instead of optimizing economic output measured by GDP, we will redefine sectors as systems that provide a societal function, human needs, nutrition, mobility, shelter, essential consumer goods, and their supporting systems such as water and energy. This will allow cross-sector innovation and shifts to more future-fit business models. And what would be most critical, immediate, concrete policy-related steps to start implementing some of these basic shifts? Let me repeat the most important question we should answer. How do we meet human needs and maximize our well-being in the most energy and resource-efficient way? First, one could not overstate the importance of changing market signals. As long as markets will be the core distributional mechanism, market signals we receive as producers and consumers matter most. They are still telling us that it makes more economic sense to destroy rather than protect nature. This is incredibly difficult to reverse since we are all so used to not value nature, so used to existing prices, relative relations among them. Changing tax structures to stimulate the change. Taxing, as Anders mentioned, rich people more resources and less labor. Taxing with higher rates all we would like to get rid of, and with lower rates all we would like to have more of, would be an important and necessary concrete step. Using all the public money for public interest, using state subsidies exclusively for supporting and speeding up transition, it's also critically important. Getting rid of tax havens sounds also like no-brainer, but it's still a prevailing escape room for rich people and companies. Power of public procurement for stimulating change is enormous and not yet well used for supporting transition. In summary, ministers for finance should finally understand that their role is not only keeping budgets in balance, but also, and most importantly, providing the needed market signals supporting and enabling the necessary transition. Then, second, lack of fairness and income differences in our societies, even if one could be proud of what we have achieved in Europe in this context, are not making transition easier either. Globally, even less, in particular in low-income countries. Many can simply not afford any additional increases of essential good prices. Therefore, environmental and social transition leading the way to a fairer and more equal world must go hand in hand, or we will fail, and our sincere efforts will be in vain. Changes which are not acceptable are simply not acceptable, even if well-designed and well-intended. And finally, considering the fact that valuing nature, while critical, will likely take time before being fit for purpose, future-fit business models based on service provisioning logic are a major opportunity to stimulate producers delivering human needs while reducing the use of energy and resources. Let me give you just one example how the logic works. If I'm the owner of the refrigerator which is behind me, of course, the producer is basing his profits according to the number of refrigerators sold to us consumers. It's, by the way, not too much interested that we can repair it, that's repairable. Actually, it's more interested that repairing it is more costly than replacing it with a new one. But this is extremely resource consuming model. So if, for example, but I actually don't need a refrigerator, I need cool food and healthy food. So if they would be selling me, I don't know, for 10 euros per month, a service of cooling my food, but they would still be the owners of the refrigerator, they would be stimulated to use as few refrigerators, which means that they would be repairable, that they would be designed totally differently, that they would last longer. And by the way, one can extend that logic on many resource areas and products. And this approach is fully based on the logic of provisioning systems delivering human needs, as explained before. All other policy relevant areas like innovation, technological progress, financial assistance supporting the transition, and so on, are of course also important for the success and deserve the attention, but the intention of our contribution is not to cover all the necessary policy aspects, but rather to concentrate, like we did in our paper, on most important, but too many times not sufficiently regarded aspects of resource management and the demand side of our economy equation. To conclude, dear friends, the world has changed. Anders mentioned the 1972 Club of Rome, the limits to growth. By the way, the number of population in 1972 was 3.8 billion. A few months ago, we have surpassed 8 billion. We moved from an empty world dominated by nature to a full world dominated by humans. Since we did not listen well to the limits of growth, we moved from the limits to growth to the growth of limits. And you know those limits well. For the first time in human history, we face the emergence of a single, tightly coupled human socio-ecological system of planetary scope. Just think about climate change, pandemics, internet, trade, travel, global security threats, and I could continue. We are more interconnected and interdependent than ever, and our collective and individual responsibility has enormously increased. You will recall that the World Economic Forum, by the way, not the Greenpeace or any other environmental organization, but World Economic Forum, has, on the basis of estimates done on the basis of public survey done among the business leaders, came with top 10 risks. In the 2 years perspective, it's a kind of mixed bag, but in the 10 years perspective, I will just mention the first 6 of them. First, failure to mitigate climate change. Second, failure of climate change adaptation. Third, natural disasters and extreme weather events. Fourth, biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse. Fifth, large-scale involuntary migration. And sixth, natural resource crisis. So practically, it's environment. And this is the message coming from the business leaders. So we don't want that this 10 years perspective would become the 2 years perspective. And by the way, we are heading in that direction. So without a real system change, we will not miss only the climate and biodiversity targets, but more, because access to and use of natural resources have been in the human history always so closely related to the level of well-being achieved, but also to the stability, security, conflicts, wars. Just remember the importance of the access to land, water, oil and gas, minerals, precious metals, the whole history, if I can call it, of the colonialization of nature, so central also to the question of fairness and equity. The lessons learned recently from the terrible war from pandemic, the hottest summer since we started to record the temperature, are more than convincing to understand that changing our relationship with nature, it's ultimately not only environmental, but also an economic, equality, security, resilience imperative. This relationship is not stable nor balanced, and it will be resolved either with collective wisdom and effort or in a hard and very painful way, through conflict, through hunger, through pandemics, migration, and again, I could continue. So this is actually the choice we have. This is the real question behind our sustainability efforts. Thus, we must broaden and strengthen the front of stakeholders advocating for change and putting existing chronic challenges in a strategic context. I hope that will be well recognized and also considered when designing the follow-up of the European Green Deal vision. It is not about either fixing the current acute crisis challenges or effectively addressing the chronic ones. Taking painkillers to remove the acute pain do not heal chronic diseases, rather hides them and make them worse. It is about solutions which would simultaneously provide answers to both. So the future will be green, or there will be no future. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot. May I just add one thing after this very good description by an account by Janez. To address overconsumption by providing for human needs in smarter and more intelligent ways is an obvious way forward. But I believe in the longer term, this will not suffice. We will also need to challenge the whole issue of what is quality of life. And we are suggesting in Earth for All that we move from focusing on production growth rather on well-being indicators. But that will, of course, require a discussion on what is quality of life. And quality of life is not only consumption of stuff, material consumption. It goes much, much further, as we know. And we believe very strongly that this whole notion of sufficiency will require an in-depth discussion in society around what is quality of life. But if we can start this discussion by providing for human needs in a more intelligent way, I think that would be a very crucial first step. Thank you. And now over to you, Sirpa.
Thank you very much for your very impressive introduction on the topic, both Janez and Anders. Highest quality of thinking as always. You are the cornerstones of the global EU, and as a matter of fact, the cornerstones of the global change and well-being. So very highly appreciated your presence here and your intervention. I'll take the benefit, and then the Roland helped me with other questions to summarize a bit of my thoughts and to put a question. I think that you are very clear on your message, and most of us can hear you and understand. We need different kind of a metering, different kind of human well-being beyond the GDP metering, and this is what the UN is working at the moment. We need to implement this idea in our politics, in our legislation. This is how you meet the semesters, EU budgets, where you put, as Janez said, your public money. It is a question of what kind of incentives, disincentives you have investments. The taxonomy didn't do that well in EU, but the idea still, I think, is very good. It needs a major shift in our economic thinking. So we are actually not talking so much about the environmental politics. We are talking about economics and economic policies. And actually, this should be on the forefront on the next Commission's work program. And it should entail this kind of a list of what and in what time frame should be changed in our legislation framework, like in our common agricultural policy, textiles, construction, and so forth. But then again, and this is the tough, mean question that I can't solve as a policymaker. How do you sell this? I hope that we could have this kind of a network of thinkers and universities to have this roadshow in all of the member states. You are doing it already in World Economic Forums and other business gatherings, but in the member state, on the nation level also. And we all know the growing populism that says, no, it's just the other people coming here that are the problem. It's just the climate, still people saying climate change is a part of the natural cycle of the globe. And they are promising eternal economic growth. So how do we combat this resistance that is very strong in my own political group, PPP, as you know, but that not that far from the Renew either. And even the Social Democrats are very inclined to support the growth concept because of the afraid of what the voters will say. And so how we change the politics, the political agenda, because the urgency message doesn't seem to get through as strongly as it should have done.
Well, not easy questions. The Club of Rome, we never said that we should degrow. What we said was that the human footprint cannot continue to increase all the time, and we need to find a way of using natural resources that is more intelligent. The challenge, of course, is that we have still in this world 4 billion people who are very, very poor and who really need, if not conventional growth, they need growth. But they need the intelligent growth. Herman Daly once said, you have to distinguish between economic growth and uneconomic growth. So it's as you indicated, Sirpa, it's very much a question of how you measure and what you measure. But here again, quality of life comes in. And the example that Janez provided with the product as a service instead of owning stuff, I think is a very intelligent way of approaching this. It cannot work in every sector, but it can work in many, many sectors. So I think product as a service is one intelligent way of also convincing policymakers that incentives have to be changed so that is going to happen. I participated in a discussion with the construction industry the other day in Sweden, and I was told that a new brick costs around $1 or €1. A reused brick costs about $2 or €2. No wonder that the construction company would use a new brick. So the incentives are so flawed, and I think Janez gave a number of examples on that. So that I think we have to use examples from real life. Janez, over to you.
Yeah, just a short thing to add to what you have said, Anders. In the first place, one needs to answer the question when talking about degrowth, or one needs to answer the question what actually you consider as growth. It was mentioned a few times already, and as long as we consider GDP, we have the problem. That's clear. But you haven't heard during my nor Anders' presentation that I was talking about need to limit the human needs. It will happen anyway because of external pressures, if it will happen, if we will not act pretty swiftly and quickly. But I was talking more about how to provide them in different way, how to actually stimulate in the first place producers, but also, of course, consumers, that these needs would be met in a less resource-intensive way. So it's actually degrowth of resources, which is absolutely needed. But as you know very well, services are also part of the GDP structure, the major part of GDP structure, even if we would measure the whole growth in the GDP. So I think it's not so difficult to explain it, that this is not a message which should create a panic, but it's a message of common sense. And it's a message which needs to be taken very seriously, or we will come into the situation where panic among the policymakers and everybody will actually occur.
You are both very right on what you said, and said already on the first line of your presentations. Maybe I'm just too pessimistic, because having to counter these debates, as you both know, day in and day out, and even though it would make so much sense, as Anders said, to swift the construction that is the huge bulk of resource consumption and energy consumption, to be more circular, more long-standing, more energy efficient, and actually you can build better and more beautiful buildings that provide better living standards for human beings. And still, the majority of my colleagues are resisting the change and saying, no, you can't do it, it will destroy the economy, it will destroy the construction, and it's not possible. And no, you do not need to tell it to me that, yes, we know it won't happen, and actually it is a substantial part of the construction industry that are more radical and demanding for this change. So maybe it is only this kind of a one-to-one debate discussion what we need to really sort of put the alarm on the right place. And I'm just thinking to have the discussions on the group leaders also. I'm happy to do what I can do in EPP, but as we know, it's a hard work, but we are prepared for that. Now I would like
to just ask him a simple question. What is the alternative they are proposing?
And let me add, Sirpa, when we talk about construction, I see more and more interest among traditional construction companies to focus more on what can we do with what is already produced. How can we use an old building, renovate it, and make it into a new building instead of just building new buildings? Of course, in many developing countries, you will have to erect new buildings because there's a need for housing for billions of people. But you need not do it in steel and cement. You can do it in wood and bamboo. Substitution is another issue that is very interesting. So there are many alternatives, and I think we should invite some of the leaders of the construction companies, for instance, to the political groups and have a seminar and show that given the right incentives, this makes sense for everyone.
This is true, and sometimes, but this is an old story. It sort of boils down to lobbying, that those ones who resist the change and have high not the ability or the willingness, in many cases neither of them, are the hardest lobby and financiers for political campaigns and groups. And we would need to change this message channel. Now, Roland, I tried to look the chat and the hands, but I didn't see Ville Niinistö has a hand up. So I'll give the floor to Ville. And Roland, if you see hands that I don't see, please give me the info.
Okay, thanks, Sirpa. Yeah, thanks, Sirpa. And good morning to everybody, and also good morning to Anders and Janez. I've worked with both before, so nice to see you both and with such an interesting topic today as well. I'm also a new vice president of the Globe EU, so nice to be part of this network in this new role. And maybe my question is that what you have been working on and what we are discussing here today is maybe the weak link in EU's Green Deal policy, because there are still ideas that we just increase extraction in Europe and we will be less dependent on resources from outside Europe, and we can solve the problems that we have on strategic autonomy by, for example, scaling up mining in Europe. But we all know that the globe and the natural resources that we have globally, but also within Europe, are not enough for such a scale up of extraction in Europe. So the demand side change in material efficiency is a big part of the equation. And I think my worry here is that Green Deal goes well in Europe as long as we are not talking about the paradigm shift. So we do parallelly green things, and then we continue to do the things that we've always done, maybe try to redefine them a bit. But there is also a lot of demand that will not be within the planetary boundaries. So maybe my question to you is, how do you see EU policies, that what we can do on the basis of your work, what we should be better at doing, and what are the sectors that are maybe more lagging behind? I can personally say, having worked with the LULUCF regulations, so that is the carbon sinks in land use, I was the Parliament's rapporteur on that file. I see that in land restoration, I know this is also an area what Janez knows very well, but land system restoration, ecological restoration, increase of carbon sinks in regenerative farming and forestry can bring a lot of benefits to biodiversity, a lot of benefits to carbon sinks, but also a more circular approach, what you're talking about. But the systemic shift is not happening in how we use land, and the gap is not yet there. So I can see that this one sector where we are lacking behind, and there's still kind of like old-fashioned conflict between economy and the environment, which in the long term, there will be no economy if that is not regenerated, that sector as well. So how can we solve these issues, and maybe also more specifically on the issue of mining versus circular economy in resource use, what kind of taxation and guidance we need to make reuse and recycling more economically efficient than extraction of minerals in areas in Europe where the environmental impact will be quite heavy. This is also applies to Anders' home country, Sweden, as well as Finland, my home country, because we are countries where the extraction pressure is going to be quite hard on the mineral use. Thank you.
Anders, if you want, I can start here because I was quite involved in thinking around the recent Critical Raw Materials Act. If you want, my assessment is that Critical Raw Materials Act, it's to an important extent missed opportunity. So focusing on alternative sources instead of thinking how could we actually make ourselves more resilient by really asking in the first place what could be done in different way that we become more resilient. And if you would look to the section which is talking about environmental part of the CRM, it's actually again going back 10 years and considering circularity as waste and recycling. And that is simply not the right and enough ambitious way to go. So as at minimum, what I think you should try to do in the parliament is pushing the concept of circularity back into a more comprehensive logic than it's actually included there. So you would not find anything about business models, anything about the things, how to actually save some of the resources and become less dependent. At the end, it's not about how we will replace one with another, because we know that the core problem is that we are using too much. And yeah, of course, on the top of that, currently, due to the things which are happening around us, it's obvious that that this strategic autonomy we are also talking about, it's an issue. But all in all, I think it's really important to understand everything what is currently happening in the context of not only these current challenges, but also not only the acute, but also the chronic ones, which are with us for decades, and we need to solve them simultaneously. And by the way, that was also the core reason. You would remember that I have ended my introduction by saying that it is really important to start to understand that when we talk about the transition, we are not talking about only protecting environment. We basically talk about the security story, the migration of the future story, which of course other people should be concerned, not only the people who are concerned with environmental preservation. And I sincerely hope that people will be smart enough to connect these two strategic sides in the follow-up of the European Green Deal, because this is the way how to integrate the answers to the short-term story of the terrible war which is happening in our neighborhood and the consequences of it with the major challenges which we are facing in stabilizing our planet and adopting our behavior. So if we don't do it that way, if we don't enlarge the front of those who will strategically defend that kind of developments, I think we have quite a serious challenge that people will immediately again go on short before long term, and you know what is then the consequence of that. And simply this boundary of short versus long, as I have tried to show also through the logic of World Economic Forum, this boundary, it's, if they are talking about 10 years, come on guys, 10 years for any business is not anymore long term, it's short term, and you need to consider it in that way. And we need to simply look to those questions. The time horizon and the opened doors are closing. And it's not, we don't have actually anymore the option of thinking different way, because we will be sooner or later forced by things which we don't want that it would happen. And they would not only happen from environmental side, they will happen from different sides, which are also becoming very clearly part of that reality. But disconnecting these two stories, it's simply a mistake because they are connected.
Can I add one thing, and that is that I think we cannot continue to just let the economy expand without limits. And one way of going about it would be to try to picture where do we want to be in 5 or 10 or 15 years, and not only in terms of carbon emissions, but in terms of, in this case, resource use in different areas, and then backcast how we can get there in a more intelligent way. And as long as we don't use the mechanism or the methodology of backcasting, I think this is going to be very, very difficult. We also see in some areas that on the one hand, there is projections that we need 5 times or 10 times as much lithium or other rare earth metals. At the same time, we also see that there are new methodologies, new technologies coming online that don't require all these metals. So I don't think we can take it for a given that metals will have to increase the way that is being portrayed. So this backcasting sort of methodology, I think, is very, very interesting. But the transition from fossil fuels to electrification and renewables will, of course, require a lot of new materials. But there is also going to be a lot of metals and materials that are being emptied or being freed up because we don't use the fossil fuel base any longer. There is a lot of infrastructure where we could reuse some of that and compensate for the demand. So I think we have to be not conventional. We have to be unconventional in the approach.
Thank you, Ville, and thank you, Anders and Janez. I don't see any hands right now. Do you, Roland, see them?
No questions at the moment, Sirpa.
Okay. Can I make a proposal for you, you two, knowing that you are hardworking men? Because I'm very tempted to have this kind, and of course, I would like to have your comment whether this thinking makes any sense. To have this kind of a two-way approach. The first one would be with Globe EU and others, the interested MEPs, and maybe some people from Commission, to try to sketch the needed policy changes in legislative level. Now I'm not going on the level of articles, but for example, this backcasting as and the cost of non-action as part of the impact assessment, this beyond the GDP as the next measurement of EU economy, the changes in financial regulation, what would be needed in on the understanding and evaluating sunk investments. Personally, I don't know, but I have a sort of a hunch that the lithium investments might be this kind of a sunk investment rather soon, because there are so much new technologies in the battery field coming, and it takes quite a long time to have a mine up and running, and then you might have already the new technologies on play and materials on place. The salt, for example, has very interesting avenues there. And then this actually could be something to be lobbied, and maybe we could get quite a number of business organizations and business leaders to do that with us. Then the second is that because this is a huge educational task, what needs to be done, especially in the parliament and in the member states. Could we imagine some sort of an course, semi-obligatory course that is organized by scientists, by some other civil society actors, business actors. I'm trying to have this kind of a lucrative sort of a gathering, of course, trade unions, that we could try to catch all the new MEPs, re-elected or firstly elected, to invite them, and if they do not come to the course, it could be a couple of 3 hours, let's say, in 3 weeks or whatever is the model then to be made. Then there would be a group of people trying to make the initiative to meet these people. And then, of course, to visit all of the political groups. Now, when after the election, as you know, after we've interviewed before and after we interviewed the commissioner candidates, there's this kind of a time. And I think that we could push almost all the political groups to have this kind of a session. By this logic, if everybody else, then we should do. And there might be 1 or 2 groups who do not want to do that, because the understanding is lacking. I'm afraid. How would you react on these things?
But we are there to help. So wherever you will find that it's useful, happy to help. As you know, I'm pretty much located in Brussels, and for me it's relatively easy. But I think one core thing which your colleagues should understand is nobody is actually against the transition which is happening in energy sector. But even according to Energy EA, if you look to the needs of materials come in the renewable production, like wind and solar, and compare it to the traditional fossil fuel based, you need few times more materials for that. And if you look at also on the demand side, when you look in particularly on this story of the replacement in the car industry of the combustion car with the electric car, which again it's important part of the solution, but in the electric car you need, according to their figures, 10 times more materials than in the conventional car. So what we are trying to say is, my dear friends, everything what you are today building in either in renewable energy or in the cars, it's the waste of the future. So be careful, because that's why the core question for us is how it's possible to meet the human needs, how it's possible the needs with using in the first place less energy, and for less energy then and less material, you need less materials. And we will never talk about cars, we will always talk about mobility, because the idea, it's not to make as many cars as we have produced in the past, but to keep people mobile. That's the idea. And how to keep them mobile in the most resource and energy efficient way. because otherwise we will hit another wall. So replacing the fossil fuel story with the material story, it's simply a new lock-in where we have to be careful while we go on this travel, which is important and necessary, and not asking the question, how can we actually make ourselves more resilient? How can we save some of those resources? It's absolutely a totally missed opportunity and actually the direction which will cause us problems.
And I think in our paper, the deep dive paper, I think we explain quite in detail how mobility in cities could be organized differently, and that just replacing combustion engines with electric vehicles is not the solution. And I think at least many young people resonate quite well with that kind of thinking, because they understand that it's rather stupid that every household owns their own car, which stands idle 95% of the time. It occupies a lot of space, etc., etc. We could organize things in a much more intelligent way, but we have to use our imagination, and we have to not take for granted that everything has to continue as before. But I think to organize workshops with the political groups around the demand side, that could be very interesting. We would need a couple of hours at least, but it could be very interesting, because I think most people have not really seen this. They have been preoccupied by cleaning the production, not about thinking, can we maybe provide for needs in a more intelligent way? And that's really the message here.
Now we've consumed all of our time, important resource also. A wholehearted big thank you for you, Janez and Anders, and we'll come back to both of you on this idea how to take the next steps on this kind of a workshop model for political groups, and then on building this kind of a sort of a list, a memorandum on what legislation should be changed and how. I'll thank you very much of all of our attendees. Hope you enjoyed as usual, and keep on your eyes on your email for upcoming Globe events and wake up calls. They are really worth and the food for thought.